Hello and welcome to Inclusive Design 24 2018. It's brought to you in partnership with Barclays Access, the Paciello Group, Intopia, Microsoft Edge, and Open Access Technologies. Please subscribe to Inclusive Design 24 on YouTube by visiting youtube.com/Inclusive Design 24 and hitting the subscribe button.
First up is the talented Seren Davies and the beautiful Mr. Bruce Lawson, who are going to be talking to us with a fabulous talk on a subject that's very close to all our hearts at Inclusive Design 24, the fact that the web really is for everyone. Take it away, guys.
Hi, thank you, Leonie, Ian, and all the sponsors, and thanks to the millions of you who've dialed in. I'm Bruce Lawson. I am an ancient and cadaverous old man of the web. I've been working for Smashing Magazine now for a week and a half, and together with my glamorous assistant, trusty co-presenter Seren Davies, we're going to talk to you briefly about This Is For Everyone. Memorably, as Sir Uncle Timbo said when he switched on the lights for the London 2012 Olympic Games, this is for everyone. And immediately over to the delightful, the delectable, the super talented Seren Davies.
Hello, so I want to talk to you about accessibility. I think usually when we think about accessibility, we tend to focus on the permanent sides, so things such as being dyslexic, blind, or using the use of certain limbs. But I think accessibility is far wider than this, and we can cover the temporary and situational sides as well. These are things that we normally wouldn't consider disabilities, but I think are things that very much affect our ability to carry out tasks. Some great examples of this are having a cataract, breaking an arm, to simply having one too many drinks at the pub. But I think accessibility can be broken down even further, and we can look at it in terms of the areas of the body that get affected. And these are cognitive, touch, speech, hearing, and sight. And these are some of the areas that I want to look at with you briefly today, and break them down into that permanent, temporary, and situational sides, and look at how, when we think about the accessibility on the broader term, we can make the web a better place for everybody like Tim wanted it to be. So let's start off by looking at cognitive accessibility. I think this is a huge part of accessibility, but often one of the most forgotten about. I think this is the fact that it is just so broad. It covers everything from being dyslexic, ADHD, all the way to something like epilepsy, something that we usually wouldn't consider when designing and building for the web. But it's actually super important to think about. So let's look at an example of something which we don't always think about in terms of cognitive accessibility, and that's animation. I think animation is crucial in our web design, and it can play such an important role in helping people understand what's going on and guiding and aiding them through an experience. However, when done badly, I think it can have the opposite effect and really prevent people from being able to carry out tasks on our websites and distract them from what they were trying to do. So let's look at an example of animation done badly, in my opinion. This is my Works Jira board. It was recently updated, and to let everybody know, they included this marquee tag at the top of the page. Now, the problem with this is I am dyslexic, and I can quite often find reading a bit of a challenge. So I use my hand on my cursor to guide myself along. Now, the problem with this and moving text is that's a lot of work. You're constantly having to think about where the words are moving to while you're trying to read them, and keep focus and process everything in your brain. And it's a lot going on. Another thing is some people with dyslexia experience words dancing on the page. And this can be where a word in a sentence could appear above or below it. So we get this funky effect of words sort of dancing all over the page and appearing where we don't expect them to be. Now, imagine experiencing that while trying to read moving text. That's really difficult, and you're not going to want to read this text that someone thinks is so important that needs to be read and moving. You're going to gloss over it because it's a lot of cognitive load for you. Another thing to consider is ADHD. This red moving text is constantly fixed to the top of the page. It doesn't matter how far down you scroll, it's always there. So imagine reading your JIRA ticket and seeing the task that your project manager would like you to do that day, or replying to a comment in someone else's ticket to try and help them with their work, but your attention always being brought back to the top, because that's where the big red shiny moving thing is. It's going to be really distracting, and it's going to take you a lot longer to carry out these tasks than it probably would. But like I said, I think animations are really important in how we build the web. And a great example of animation done well, in my opinion, is Smashing Mag. Now, they've done animation quite simply. They've got it on their hover states. So they changed the colour of the text on the page from being white to black, and they moved their icons from being tilted on their side to upright. Now, this is a really subtle change, but it lets us know where we are in the page and sort of gives us an idea of what we could do there. Another thing they do is they've got animations on this toggle button, but seriously red, which will swap the background colour in the text out for something else. They have a circle, and half the circle is filled in, and when you hover over it, the other half of the circle gets filled in and the other half goes back to being blank. We can kind of tell what this button's going to do without it having to outright tell us. So it's giving us little hints along the way and helping us. So when we choose to use animation on our website, just need to be careful that it's adding to the message we're trying to get across, and it's not distracting people away from the tasks that they're trying to do. And if the animation is distracting, we don't necessarily have to take it away altogether. We can just think about a simple way that we could simplify it and dial it back a little bit. Next, I want to talk to you about being drunk or tipsy. This is something that we would never really consider when thinking about accessibility. But I think drinking is very much a situational disability. The very definition of being drunk is when we're in a state where our mental and physical capabilities are temporarily impaired by an excess of alcohol. I know for one that after I've had one too many drinks, I probably can't carry out tasks the same as I could when I hadn't been drinking. So let's look at an app that's designed for people who are going out drinking to use. This is Untapped. This is an app where people can keep track what beers and ciders they've been drinking on a night out, whether that's from a local brewery or from halfway across the world. But the issue here is they don't have great colour contrast. They've chosen yellow and white, which are two of the worst possible colours we could ever have together. The reason why this is an issue is once we've had one too many drinks and we've put our beer goggles on and things start to blur together, those elements with low colour contrast blend in. So on the right hand side, we have this yellow box which has white text on top which says check in. Now, the colour contrast there is non-existent, so it's all merging together and we can't really tell that that does say check in, compared to the beer names, which are a darker brown on a white background, and we can still distinguish what that is. So let's look at an app which I think has got designing for people who are going out drinking down to a T. This is Citymapper. Citymapper have got a better colour contrast than Untapped before. They've got a white background with green text. This could still be improved upon, but at least it's a lot better than yellow and white, which we were seeing before. The interesting thing here is, if you set your app up correctly in Citymapper and set your home location, the Get Me Home button will get progressively bigger as the evening goes on. And this means that our attention is instantly drawn here because that's the big shiny element on the page. And hopefully we're more likely to click on the Get Me Home button than the Get Me to Work button below it. Now, I'm not saying that we all need to go away and make our add to cart buttons get bigger as the evening progresses. But I do think, on the whole, we need to be a lot more aware of people who are drinking using our apps and websites. And simply by adhering to good practices, such as having good colour contrast and using simple language, such as get me home, compared to a more complicated version, we're going to be helping those people out. The thing I always like to think of here is our apps and websites could be the thing that helps somebody get home safely at night. So now let's look at touch or movement. And I think this is something that's so common in the world that we often forget about when designing for the web. So an example of where we haven't really considered issues with touch or movement is Google and their links. When creating the web, we like to provide these really small clickable areas, like we can see here with Google. Now, if you want to click on one of these links, your cursor has to be exactly on that word, not a pixel or two out, exactly on that. If you find motor control maybe quite challenging, then this can be a lot of work for you. And you might eventually get your mouse there for, say, someone else to knock you and your cursor to move off it, and you have to go through that process all over again. I feel like we're making people work to be able to navigate around our sites when we shouldn't have to do that. Something else here is you might say, well, people can just tab through these navigation items and links and menus. And that is true, but if I was to go up to my grandparents and tell them that it was okay, they could just tab through, they would stare at me blankly, because not everybody knows about this functionality. As developers, we're aware we can tab through, but a lot of people don't know that functionality exists. So the way I think we can fix this is by simply making clickable areas bigger. This example here is TU. This is Sainsbury's clothing brand, and their top navigation item is a lot bigger than Google's before. As soon as your cursor gets anywhere near one of the words, such as holiday, home, women, a grey highlighted box appears around it. All of this highlighted area is clickable. So this means people don't have to be so accurate with their cursors to be able to navigate around their sites. We're making it easier for them. Another thing we can think about here is by making clickable areas bigger, we're making it more accessible for those who are viewing our sites on mobiles, because our fingertips are a lot bigger than a cursor. So we're more likely to be able to tap those buttons rather than really small text. Now I want to talk to you about sight. Usually when we think about sight and accessibility, I think we tend to focus on people who have lost their vision and need to use assistive technologies like screen readers. And while this is so important, and we really do need to make sure the web is screen reader friendly, I think it means that other areas can get overlooked, such as being colorblind or having tunnel vision. So when we build the web, we like to include these really big, beautiful images that take up all of the website. But do we ever think about how the effect they're having? Are they taking away from that message that we're trying to portray? This example here is Webco. They're a web agency based here in Oxford in the UK. And they've got this really beautiful black and white image of the Bodleian libraries. But the issue is they've got white text on top of that. Now this means in some places you'll have best possible color contrast you could have of white on black. But in other areas, you're going to have the worst possible color contrast of white on white. So I have relatively good eyesight, and I really struggle to read this and distinguish the text from the background. So how can we expect someone who maybe is colorblind to see this? Something else we can consider here is viewing this website on a really sunny day with the sun glaring from behind us. This is an example of a site that we just wouldn't be able to see because the color contrast just isn't there. Something else we can think about here when choosing to use images as background is the detail of the image. This one here is black and white. It's of the Bodleian Library, so it's a real photo. And it's very detailed. We've got columns and windows and buildings, and you can kind of get distracted within that image and not be focusing on that text. So when I was writing this talk, trying to think of a way that WebCurl could go about fixing this issue, and I actually redesigned their website. They've still gone for this big, beautiful image. This time it's some mountain hills in the desert, and they've got purples, pinks, and blacks with white text on top. But this is okay now, because the color contrast between the background and the text is a lot greater. We can now distinguish between the two. Also, the background picture is a lot less busy and has loads of things going on. So we don't get lost in what the background image is compared to that text, which is giving us the message. Now, I'm not saying we should stop using these big, beautiful images, but I do think we need to be a lot more aware when we're using them and make sure that the text we put on top is still readable and that message that we are trying to get across to people can be got across. And we're not doing things for the sake of things being pretty. Finally, I want to talk to you about being deaf or hard of hearing. We love having videos on the web, whether that's cat videos, tutorials on how to do something, or even technical talks like you're hearing now. But the issue is, do we ever think about what happens when people can't access the audio files? This could be because they are hard of hearing, so it can make up certain sounds and noises, but can't quite put it all together. Or they could be deaf, so can't actually hear the content. To simply, they've forgotten their headphones on the bus one day, or they're in the library. They don't want to be that annoying person who makes the entire room or bus listen to their video. But this, to me, is quite a simple solution. And it's just we need to provide captions. The BBC is a great example of this. They caption every single video that they put out there. It doesn't matter if it's a 60-second news clip, an hour-long episode of a TV program, or a full film. They will caption it all, which is great, because it doesn't matter if somebody has access to the audio or not. They're still getting that message that we tried so hard to get across to them. Another great thing about captions is we can translate them, which means that we can translate these to multiple different languages and get the content across to a bunch of people all over the world. But captions are hard. This isn't something that we can go away and do today or tomorrow. We need real people to write them so they make sense to real people. But they are so worth it because it does mean your content can get across to so many other people, and all that hard work that you've put in can pay off. Now, I've covered a few odd little bits of accessibility, but there's some of the areas that I think often get overlooked and that we don't think about. But they play such an important role in making sure the web is for everybody, like Tim wanted it to be. Now, Bruce is going to talk to you about other areas of accessibility that you might not have considered before.
Thank you, Seren. Hi, I'm Bruce. I often sport a green mohawk or a pink mohawk. Although I have a punk rock hairstyle, I have the t-shirt and the heart of a hippie. I now work for Smashing magazine. They have two different avatars for me, depending upon whether I'm mohawked or whether my hair's having one of its George Clooney-esque salt and pepper interludes. Before that, I was working at Wix, and Wix has 110 million users in 190 countries. And before that, I was deputy CTO of Opera, the web browser people, the majority of whose customers are from the emerging economies: Bangladesh, India, Nigeria, Indonesia, the ex-Soviet Union, etc. And I was born in Yemen and lived many years in Asia. So I've a great interest professionally and personally in the emerging world, shall we say. In 2016, the World Bank wrote a very large document, 360 pages of PDF, called Digital Dividends, in which they wrote about the successes and the challenges of IT across the world. And they noted that the world's population is 7.4 billion people. But of those, only 1.1 billion are like us, with fast enough internet so that we can watch, live streamed videos like the one you're watching now. There are 3.2 billion people in the world with some internet access, 5.2 billion who have mobile phones, but therefore 2 billion of those mobile phone users don't access the web. And in the world, 7 billion people are within reach of mobile coverage. So you can see that less than 50% of the world's potential web users are connected. And perhaps unsurprisingly, the majority of the world's offline population are in India and China, primarily because those are the two most populous countries in the world, each making about 20% of the world's population by itself. 1 billion people in India are offline, 755 million in China, 213 million in Indonesia, 165 million in Pakistan. But it's not all emerging markets. The Russian Federation has 65 million offline people. Even the US has 51 million people who are not online. But it's fair to say that whatever business you're in, unless you're running a local pizza shop, the majority of your customers will be from the emerging world, simply because of demographics. There are more people alive right now inside this circle than there are outside this circle. APAC, Asian Pacific area, is hugely populated, and with a very young population as well. Africa at the moment is 1 billion human beings. The United Nations predicts that by 2050, not very long away, that will double to 2 billion. And by 2100, when the world's population will peak and stabilize at 11 billion, Africa alone will be 5 billion people. This has led to lots of people predicting widespread famine and catastrophe. This isn't a new feeling of apocalypse. This is the Reverend Thomas Malthus, who in the 18th century predicted that most people would die because we couldn't produce enough food to feed the population. And but don't worry, because Africa is big. The Mercator projection on maps lies to us. Africa, in reality, is so big that it can comfortably fit the United States, China, India, and Western Europe in its landmass. Paul Ehrlich in 1968 was another Malthusian who in his essay The Population Bomb wrote, "The battle to feed all of humanity is over. In the 1970s, hundreds of millions of people will starve to death in spite of any crash programs embarked upon now. At this late date, nothing can prevent a substantial increase in the world's death rate." And of course, we know that didn't happen. And one of the main reasons this didn't happen is because of an unsung hero who I hadn't heard of a year ago, Mr. Norman Borlaug, who won the Nobel Prize in 1970 and is credited with saving over 1 billion people worldwide from starvation. Mr. Borlaug developed a high-yield strain of wheat with far more ears on it than had ever been cultivated before. His first attempt didn't work because the ears were so heavy that the wheat bent double and would rot in rain. So he fattened up the stalks, made them more robust, And countries like Mexico, India, and Pakistan went from net wheat importers to feeding their own populations, excuse me, and becoming 3 of the biggest wheat exporters in the world. Borlaug believed that technology could be used to liberate and enhance the people in the emerging world. And I believe that too with the internet. Because by 2100, when Africa is 5 billion people and the world is 11 billion, 50% of the world's population will live in these 10 nations. Only one of them is what we would now call the developed world. That's the US, and sometimes looking at the news from the US, I doubt you can still make that claim. All of the people who've come online recently, and certainly all of those who are going to come online in the next few years, are coming online through smartphones. I am an old man. I know I don't look it, but I'm 52. When I was a kid, the idea that I could have in my pocket a device that could connect me to anywhere, anybody in the world, and access the totality of human knowledge would be sci-fi. And now I have it. It's amazing to me. It is, as market people say, game-changing. Smartphones today are overwhelmingly Android. 13% of the world uses iOS, 86% uses Android, and the other 1% is the also-rans like BlackBerry, Windows Phone, old Nokias, etc. The devices are overwhelmingly low cost and low spec. In last year's Google I/O, Google announced that 25% of all new Android shipments ship with only 512 megabytes of RAM. Many of the smartphones of the world are dual SIM. In many markets, it's very hard even to shift a phone that doesn't have dual SIM. This is because if you live in a border area, you might move SIM around to take advantage of different networks having cheaper rates at night, for example. India is an example of a country where networks are cheaper at night, so people will go and download YouTube videos, etc. in the early hours of the morning. In fact, YouTube had a specific functionality, excuse me, where you could choose to download them in those cheap rate times. Other phones are shared between a couple or even a family. There'll be one phone per household, but each family member will have his or her own SIM. Consequently, in the emerging world, networks are as overloaded as this truck that I photographed in the Rajasthani desert last year. In India, only 96,000 of the 736,000 cell towers are 3G enabled. But more critically, only 35,000 of those towers have a fiber optic connection to the backbone. And this results in an inconsistent connection. This is something of a euphemism. Having visited India 6 times, inconsistent connection is putting it rather mildly. And the reason for this is simple. Moore's law gathers apace. Phones are getting ever faster and ever cheaper. But the infrastructure that carries the network is physical, and digging up busy roads in mega cities and burying fiber optic cables is an activity that takes years or decades. This is symbolized by this photograph out of the window of my apartment in the Phetchaburi Road in Bangkok, Thailand. And this is what infrastructure looks like in many of these markets. So Bruce's law of smartness applies. It doesn't matter how smart your phone is if your network is dumb. Therefore, the street has found its own use. In Nigeria, people sideload apps and other content from third parties who have these apps downloaded to a PC and for a small fee will install apps from their computers to users' phones. We know anecdotally that when the market in Myanmar opened up and the cost of a SIM fell from 2,000 US dollars to $1.50, about 35% of the population immediately went onto Facebook. And when you buy a phone, people expect it to be loaded up with the Facebook app even before it's given to them. And the reason for this is simple. As Facebook said, downloading a typical app with a 20 megabyte APK can take more than 30 minutes on a 2G network, and the download is likely to fail before completion due to the flaky nature of the network. So if you're in India, you might spend 25 minutes downloading 18 megabytes, the network craps out, and then you have to spend another 30 minutes re-downloading 20 megabytes, and that might crap out. And that's eating up your data plan just to download an app. With space this limited, the user is comparing their personal photo collection with the adoption of a new app on their phone. Those of you who make e-commerce apps, native apps, you probably think they're the best thing since sliced bread, but I guarantee you they are not more important to a consumer than photographs of her children or her family. So in browser world and web standards land, these are not yet theme parks, but they should be. We've invented progressive web apps. I'm not going to go into a precise definition of what they are or how you make them. That's easy to find on Tinternet. But the great thing about them is they live on the server, so there's no update distribution lag. So, for example, if you've discovered a security vulnerability in your native app, it might be weeks before a consumer in India ventures into a coffee shop where there's free Wi-Fi to download your updated app. Or in Nigeria, they might never do. Therefore, there's a security vulnerability. But with a progressive web app or PWA, the moment you make a change, the next person who visits that app, because it's on the server, gets the newest version. Thus, there's no app store or gatekeeper. So small businesses in emerging economies are not paying a 30% tax to Google or Apple. Crucially, PWAs are a normal website on browsers such as Opera Mini, Safari, or Windows phones. A progressive web app is a progressively enhanced website. And on a browser that doesn't support PWAs, you just get a normal website. Nobody loses out. And because they're on the web, they're searchable, indexable, and linkable. And due to the magic of Service Worker, they can work offline, which is great for times when the network is down, or you're running out of bandwidth, it's the end of the month, or you're waiting at the bus stop in a crowded metropolis and there's simply no network to be had. It's no coincidence, therefore, that in the last couple of years since PWAs have been a thing, we've seen the best examples and the earliest examples coming out of Asia and Africa, most notably India, Indonesia, Nigeria, and Kenya. But now they're coming out all over the world. Flipkart Lite is an example. Flipkart is an e-commerce site, a competitor of Amazon, based in Bengaluru in the state of Karnataka in India. And I was very privileged to be on the stage at their launch event a couple of years ago. Excuse me. They mothballed their mobile site and just pointed everybody to the Play Store or the iOS App Store. And of 100 people who took the trouble to dial their URL into the browsers, only 4 people downloaded the app. Therefore, they lost to 96 people. So they reversed the strategy and they made their mobile site a progressive web app. They've seen 40% returning visitors week over week, 63% rise in conversions from home screen visits. Users spend 3 times the amount of time that they used to spend on the app. Thus, it's considerably better for engagement. And the reason they did that They was very simple. We want Flipkart Lite available on every phone over every Flaky network in India. In Nigeria, with PWAs, without the download overhead of native apps, developers in Nigeria can now give a great and up-to-date experience to their users. Something else in the browser land and web standards world that we've been doing to make the web more accessible to people in emerging economies is responsive images. We noticed that when retina screens came out, developers were faced with a difficult quandary. They either sent super perfect, high quality retina images to the few people who had retina screens, and black and white screens or non-retina devices would have to compress those images down to show them, wasting lots of bandwidth. Or they sent everybody low-res versions, and then people with the great retina screens saw a blurry image. Eventually, the Responsive Images Community Group managed to write a spec that worked for all the browser vendors. We crowdfunded a guy called Yoav Weiss to write the C++ for Blink and WebKit, and now it's in the HTML5 spec, and it's in all the browsers, even including mobile Safari. And this is vital because the average web page is 3.5 megabytes. That's not app or site, that's web page. And of the 3.5 meg, 1.8 meg is images. So anything you can do to make these images smaller makes the site faster and saves people's bandwidth. About a year or so, I did a talk on responsive images in Bristol in the UK. It was quite a superficial talk. I only had 45 minutes. But the next day, one of the people in the audience, a gentleman called Mike Babb, went to work and put into practice the things I talked about. And Mike discovered that using the picture element and associated related attributes, he managed to squish his homepage down by 70%. And this really matters. For people in the West, we still appreciate speed. But for people in emerging economies, bandwidth is comparatively expensive. In Germany, for example, to afford an entry-level mobile data package of 500 megabytes of data per month, you need to work for 1 hour at the average wage. In the USA, you work for 6 hours at average wage. In Nigeria, you work for 28 hours. And in Brazil, you work 34 hours. So if you're not compressing your images, you are literally wasting people's money and making them work harder. And nobody likes to work harder. Not only is it rude of you, but you can guarantee that if your competitor has compressed the images on their site so it loads faster and uses less data, they will get the business and you will lose. So practically, what can you do from my section of the talk? Make your site small, compress your images, use HTTP2, it's ready. If you're using Angular or React or some monstrous JavaScript framework, turn on server-side rendering. Give your users something to look at while they're downloading all of your JavaScript. It's parsing, executing, and constructing a DOM. Consider a progressive web app if your site is app-like. And don't autoplay media. I know that your 1 minute ad should win an award, and it's excellent. But in Nigeria, the data needed to watch just 2 minutes of online video a day can cost more than sending a child to school for a month. And I guarantee you, your cat video, your ad, is not more important than a child's education. The World Bank said in the Digital Dividends report, making the internet universally accessible and affordable should be a global priority. And Seren and I agree. We're not saying don't use big frameworks like React, ignore this scary Bucharest graffiti. But remember, 13 million requests for JavaScript will time out. That's what BuzzFeed found. Our monitoring tells us that around 1% of requests for JavaScript on BuzzFeed time out. That's about 13 million requests a month. Phil Hawksworth said, a reminder if one were needed that we should design for resilience. Because developing countries are home to 94% of the global offline population. Many people in Bangladesh or Nepal have miles to walk to find a doctor, but with a feature phone, they can download the free PDF called Where There Is No Doctor, a village healthcare handbook, translated into their local language, and that is first-degree medical triage. For many people in sub-Saharan Africa and all across the world, access to school textbooks is prohibitively expensive, but with a feature phone, access to the web, and World Reader, 551 schools and libraries in 47 countries, 606,356 monthly readers get access to tens of thousands of free books, and many of them translated into their local languages. That is schooling. And we all know there are people in the world who live in horrible regimes where having the wrong religion, the wrong political opinion, or the wrong sexuality can get you in trouble with the police or worse. And access to the web is their lifeline out to the free world. As an Egyptian internet activist said, if you want to liberate a country, give them the internet. And if you don't like all this hippie bullshit that I'm saying, there are numbers. McKinsey, which is a great big management consultancy group, said an increase in internet maturity similar to the one experienced in mature countries over the past 5 years creates an increase in real gross domestic product per capita, per person, of $500 on average during this period. And to put that into perspective, it took the Industrial Revolution of the 19th century 50 years to produce the same results. Because fundamentally, Sarah and I believe that the web is not just loads of interconnected computers.
It's not a series of clouds.
And it's certainly not a series of tubes.
It's these ladies in Africa.
It's this blind chap in Toronto.
It's these women on a bus.
It's this lady in a wheelchair in Taiwan.
It's his grandfather and his granddaughter who are farmers.
It's these gentlemen at a football game.
It's these women on a beach.
It's this gentleman with Down syndrome on the metro in New York.
The web is for everybody.
Thank you from Seren and me.
Thank you, Bruce. Thank you, Seren. That's a fantastic presentation to start us off. Really great talk.
You're very welcome.
We've been looking on Twitter. We don't have any questions, but a lot of people following along and quoting their favourite bits.
Aww.
Some about being drunk.
That's more Seren's department than mine.
So, Scott, do you have any questions for our?
I do. One question that I saw poking around was, what are some things that designers and developers can do to put themselves in the shoes of someone who may need to be more mindful of their bandwidth?
Well, there's many things that designers and developers can do, but what you could do, for example, in the Chrome DevTools, you can simply throttle the network to simulate being 2G or 3G. So that's a good start. Or you could just use a low-powered mobile device on your mobile data plan rather than office bandwidth to try it out. And there's lots of techniques that I'm sure Sarah can go into to get yourself in the mindset of somebody who has color blindness or dyslexia, for example. Cesar?
Yeah, there are lots of really useful Google or extensions on your browser which will emulate things such as tunnel vision, where it will black out a bunch of your screen and you can just see a circle at a time, or change the colors on your screen so you can kind of see how somebody with different forms of color blindness may view that page.
Any more questions before I hit my bed, because it's nearly 2 a.m. here in Blighty?
I have one for Seren, actually. I'm curious, how do you think we can encourage designers to think creatively about the challenge of not choosing those big hero images and, putting text over? How can we encourage them to think of creative solutions to these problems without sacrificing, the basic kind of creativity that they're going for?
I think one of the biggest things we can do is encourage designers that when they don't choose these big hero images, their sites don't look like every other site on the internet.
So true.
But when they go
that's a good point.
approaches and different ways of using their images, then their website is going to stand out a lot more to a lot more people. It's going to look different, as well as hopefully being a lot more accessible.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Nice one.
I'm no designer, as anybody who's seen my site knows, but I write music and poetry, and I think a lot of the creativity is stimulated by constraints, actually.
Yep, that definitely makes sense. Necessity is the mother of invention, I suppose, is the
Well, I think that's Frank
old
Zappa.
English phrase. He was the mother of invention.
A man of many talents, Leonie.
Excellent. Ian, are you going to take it from here?
Sure. I think we will wrap up. So if you liked this session, and I'm sure you did, please like the channel, like the video, and subscribe to Inclusive Design on YouTube for future notifications of videos and events like this. A reminder that Inclusive Design 24 is brought to you in partnership with Barclays Access, the Paciello Group, Intopia, Microsoft Edge, and Open Access Technologies, and with thanks to our sponsors, DQ Systems. So Inclusive Design 24 will be back on the hour. We will have Jared Smith, who will be peeling back the layers of web accessibility. So please join us then.